Hey, what's up? It's Jake, and we're going to do a little bit more scripting with for loops and kind of mess around with this a little bit to see how you're doing. So let's start with this. I want you to try to solve this as I give you the requirements. So the first thing I want you to do is make a list of numbers. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to create a list, and in this list, I'm going to make numbers. So 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89. If you don't know what that is, uh, you're not a nerd. Okay, so I have a list of numbers. Hopefully you've made a list of numbers for yourself. And the next thing I want you to do is I want you to print all of the elements that are less than 5. Here's a hint. You're going to need to use a for loop with an if statement inside of the for loop. So how do we do that? Well, I can do something like for I, and that's one way that people kind of shortly go through for like an iteration or like a number, right? So for I in A, if I is less than 5, print I. Python for 1132. It's really just that simple. All right. So let's try to add another requirement. Let's store the response in a new list and print that list. Okay, cool. So I'm going to take this code. Now I'm going to store it in a list. So instead of print I need to store this somewhere. So I need an empty list. So I'm going to make a new list that's just an empty list. And then I'm going to say if I is less than 5, x, which is the name of my list, dot append I. And then I'm going to break out of my for loop, and I'm just going to say print x. If you put this inside of it, you'll see it does something else. So now I have a list. Now what happens if I don't break out of the for loop? So if I were to put this after append, it's going to print this list after each iteration, and you should see it get bigger. And we do. And that's because it's part of the loop. So it's going to go, okay, for I and A. So here's my first I is 1. Is 1 less than 5? Yes. So x.append I, and so x now has a 1 in it. I'm going to print my list x. 1. All right, and then the loop goes back up the top. For I and A, so the second one, if 1 is less than 5, append it again. And it did that. And then 2, and it does it again. And it keeps going. And if I made this 100 and it printed the entire thing, you'd see something just like that. So that works. Let's see, how else do we want to change this up? So write it in one line of code. How would we do that? So I want to write one line of code, one very strange looking line of code. So let's say I'm going to print something, right? I need to print, and inside of that, this is where you have to think inside out and then type left to right, which is kind of crazy. So let me talk you through my process. I need to print something, and I know that it's for a number in a list, but I also need to compare that number to the number 5. So maybe I'm going to print a list. I know I'm going to do that. And I'm going to say I for I in A, if I less than 5. Clear as mud. Let's see what that does. There you go. So what this is saying is for each element and I'm going to compare this element in list A, if I is less than 5. So I need to print I for I in A if I less than 5. So this is a very strange way of writing this in like one line of code. So sometimes one line isn't as good as doing 3 lines or 4 lines if it, because I think this is much more readable for most people. But it's certainly, you can do it in one line of code. Let's see. So next, we're going to ask the user for a number and return a list that contains only elements from the original list. That's getting very long. That are smaller than the given number, something like that. Okay, so now we gotta change this up a little bit. So now we need to take some sort of input, right? So we have a list, right? And we're gonna make a new list, and because we're gonna return this list. So I could say for I and A, if I less than some sort of input, right? So let's say that we have some sort of number called num, and we're just going to compare that. No, not capital N. You silly goose. Okay, so now we need to define this, like, because it's like, what is num? And it'll say undefined variable, right? Report undefined variable. Well, num is just going to be our input, enter a number, right? But it has to be, to compare it to other numbers, it has to be an integer. So we're going to go ahead and make this an int and then ask. Enter a number, 42. And there you go. And oh, this is from my old example. So we actually need to take this print statement and we need to break out from the loop. So we can just print one time, 42. There's my list. Clear as mud. Got it? Okay, so this when you use for loops, there's usually some sort of some kind of condition inside of them when you write them. Very rarely ever will you just print out a whole list, because you could just print the list if you wanted the whole list and you would need to iterate over it. So this is an example of how to use a for loop and an if conditional statement to iterate through a sequence to create a new list and to return that value, and how to do that with custom input from a user in order to use that as the comparison number with each element in your sequence. So I hope that helps. Have fun, and this is a third script that you'll be able to add to your portfolio of things that you know how to do. It sounds silly, but you should do this, and as you get more and more complex, you'll have things you want to show off, and those can kind of be your public things, and these can be your private things. But one important thing about storing and saving these is that if you ever need to do this later, you have this saved and you don't have to go relook it up. You can just save all these little scripts, for loops, while loops, conditions, if statements, if else, elif, all that stuff. You can save these, and when somebody asks you to code something, you can copy and paste from your stuff and be like, how did I do that tax thing? And you can just go look at it. Or how did I do this binary if else kind of situation? Like, you can look all these things up later. So anyways, hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.